Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Cask of Amontillado, from the mid-1800s, the victim, Fortunato, is lured into an underground vault by Montresor to taste and authenticate the value of a cask of Amontillado. Fortunato is seduced by the very mention of this rare fortified wine and is quickly led into a trap where he's chained to the wall and bricked in by Montresor, buried alive. Reading this short story in high school, I had no idea what Amontillado was, but I thought it must have been something beautiful to behold, and indeed it is. Both Amontillado and port belong to a category of wine called fortified wines, the topic of today's lecture. You'll need the following wines for today: a ruby port from Portugal, a tawny port from Portugal, a fino sherry, or it could be a manzanilla as well, an Amontillado, or an oloroso, a Madeira, and an Australian muscat. They call them stickies. These wines are completely undervalued, which means it's a great opportunity for you. They are the perfect accompaniment to the end of a meal, or in the beginning in some cases. And in comparison to other wines, they're virtually indestructible. Some you can easily lay down the day your child is born to give to him or her on the day of their wedding. What is a fortified wine? It's a wine that's had a spirit, usually grape spirit, added to the wine. The alcoholic strength has been strengthened or fortified. The processes are quite different for creating fortified wines, which depends on the moment when the alcohol is added. Because I want you to have the time to taste the effect of these processes, grapes and terroir on these wines, I'm only going to be able to hit the highlights of how they're made. Historically, we have the sea voyagers to thank for the fortified wines. During the trade wars between England and France in the 17th century, England boycotted French wines, and England, being a thirsty nation, sought an alternative within Portugal. However, because Portugal was farther from England, many of the wines brought back were ruined by bacteria and yeast. Now, to prevent spoilage, spirits were added to kill off spoiling microbes and act as a preservative, allowing the wine to make the journey back to England in good condition. Actually, Spain had already figured out how to preserve wines. Even as Christopher Columbus made his voyages from Spain to the New World, his ships were stocked with local Andalusian wines, or sherries. Now, allegedly, when Magellan prepared to sail around the world in 1519, he spent more funds on sherry than on weapons. In the mid to late 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, en route to India, regularly stopped at Madeira, an Atlantic island owned by Portugal, to pick up casks of wine that somehow tasted even better after sailing to the tropics. We'll discuss this in a bit. So how does fortification work? There are basically two methods: the port method in Portugal and the sherry method in Spain. Port comes from Portugal, just like champagne comes from Champagne. The namesake for port derives from the Atlantic city of Oporto, the second largest city in Portugal. However, the port grapes are picked and matured in two different places. The grapes are grown in the Douro Valley, about 50 miles east of Oporto, along the Douro River. The Douro Valley is protected by mountains that keep the climate dry, sunny, and warm. This helps the grapes get very, very ripe. The soil in this area is granitic schist, and I have actually a piece of it right here. It's so hard that they have to use dynamite to blast into the rock in order to plant the vines. Now, the stone also absorbs the heat and reflects the sunlight back up onto the vines for additional ripeness. The grapes used for port are all red: Touriga Nacional, which is the most prized for its richness, Touriga Francesa for its aromatics, Tinta Barroca for its soft fruitiness, Tinta Roriz, called Tempranillo in Spain, they use this for its finesse, and Tinta Gaun, tiny grapes which add tannin. The landscape along the Douro River in the Douro Valley is stunning. The hillsides where the grapes are planted along the river are quite steep, and the vines are planted along terraces, and in some cases, in most cases actually, hand harvesting is the only option, as you can't get machines up there. The grapes are harvested and then brought to quintas. Quinta is the word for farm in Portuguese, although it also refers to a wine-producing estate or vineyard. A single quinta port, such as the Fonseca Guimarães vintage, is from a single year and from a single estate in the Douro Valley. Many producers in traditional quintas still foot-tread grapes for their highest quality ports, their vintage ports, which are only declared a few times a decade. Now, before you laugh and have visions of Lucy Ricardo from I Love Lucy stomping on grapes, or think that port smells like feet, they explain to me that there's still nothing softer and gentler in crushing grapes than the human foot. This allows rapid extraction of color and tannin. Now, think about it. If you were in this huge granite trough called lagares and pressing grapes with your feet, and you stepped on a particularly jagged cluster or stem, you wouldn't press so hard so that you wouldn't get hurt. You'd also be making better wine in the process. It's usually a 12-hour foot-treading party with a band playing and the people dancing on the grapes. Nowadays, some of the producers use mechanical feet, which aren't as good, but which are gradually improving. A neutral grape-based spirit is added to the fermenting grapes once the yeast has converted the sugar to alcohol. This brings the alcohol level of the entire mixture up from 6 to 9% to about 20% alcohol. So they fortify in the middle of the process of fermentation. The fortification kills the yeast and stops the fermentation immediately, as yeast generally can't survive above 15% alcohol. But why kill the yeast? We don't take long voyages anymore, so why not fortify it at the end of the process and not the beginning of the process? What difference does this make? Now here we have a port. It's a ruby port, and it's from Sandeman. But before we go to our 5 S's, what I want you to do is take a quick taste of this port. So what do you taste? Sweetness, right? That's the difference. When you stop the yeast from completing the fermentation process, all of the sugar hasn't yet converted into alcohol. This is the sweetness that you taste. There is residual sugar left over, which is about 100 grams per liter residual sugar, and this balances with the 20% alcohol. Timing is critical with port. So the wine is casked as soon as the fortification process is complete. Alcohol is an extracting agent, and if it's left too long with the skins or pips and stems, it would extract the harsh tannins and make the wines bitterly astringent. The newly fortified wines are now sent elsewhere. Traditionally, the pipes, which are casks that contain about 550 liters or about 733 bottles worth, were sent in small boats up the Douro River to mature in warehouses in Oporto. Because Oporto's climate is cooler and more humid than the Douro Valley, the ports can age more slowly, and the winemaker has more control over evaporation and over the interaction between the wine and the oak. Aging determines the style of the port, so let's taste to learn some of their distinguishing characteristics. Ruby port, named after its deep color, is young, and it's a non-vintage port that is less than 3 years old. So let's take a note of the color. It's pretty much a deep ruby. Now let's do our chest, chin, nose test. I smell it here, a little bit. Definitely smell it here. When you smell and taste this wine, you get rich red and black fruits. Cassis is also a good descriptor. It's often sweet without too many tannins, and great at the end of the meal, especially with chocolate. If the label says Ruby Reserve, as this bottle of Sandeman does, it means that it's a blend of higher quality wines, and it's been aged for up to 5 years before bottling. Next, we have the tawnies, a separate style. These are aged for a longer period of time in oak pipes, which are usually made from Portuguese oak, and they're a blend of different years. So when you see an indication of age on the label, for example, this says 10-year-old tawny, that means the average age of the wines that have been blended is approximately 10 years old. This is unlike what you see for Scotch, for example, where the age is indicated on the label is the youngest in the blend. So let's see the difference between the ruby and the tawny. Notice how easy it is to remember. The ruby port is a ruby color, a red color, and the tawny port definitely has a brown or tawny hue. And this is because of oxidation. Because it's been aged in oak barrels for a much longer period of time, as red wine ages, it loses its color. And it also has a lighter color. Now let's smell the aromas in the ruby versus the tawny. Definitely smell a lot of red berry notes, some cassis, even get a hint of licorice there, like black licorice. Let's smell the tawny. Wow, there's much more nuttiness to this. It smells like of walnuts, caramel, even toffee. The younger ones still have a hint of red berry notes to it, but these can last a really, really long time. And as it ages, it gets even more nutty. When I was at Taylor Flatgate a few years ago, they had me taste a tawny port back from 1900. And you wonder, what are they using that for? They actually use that in the blend for the 40-year-old tawny port that they have. Again, that's an average age. Now for the pinnacle of port, vintage port. Vintage port is not a tawny, but a ruby style that comes from one specific vintage that's been declared. Declaration can be done by individual port houses, however, and need not be unanimous. Vintage ports are typically bottled at 2 years old, and they have rich, concentrated fruit, balanced acidity, and dense, firm, and sometimes gripping tannins. And don't forget the high alcohol at 20%. It doesn't get more intense than vintage port in the world of wine. The powerful structure allows it to age very slowly, and it may not reach its peak till about 20 years. That's why I said at the beginning of the lecture that there are some wines and some fortified wines that you can present to your newborn son or daughter on their wedding day, and this is it. Vintage port in its youth can be very, very overpowering. If you have a vintage port, smell the vintage port, and you'll notice that it has not only just the cassis and the fruit notes, but you'll notice that it has in many complex layers of flavors. So you may get more intense licorice and spice like cinnamon and nutmeg. And also, it's known for having a violet kind of aroma as well. But it's very intense. And when you taste the vintage port, and if you compare it to your ruby, your basic ruby, you're going to notice the tannins are much more gripping and much more velvety, and you feel that tactile sensation. But they are more expensive, but they're worth it. Like I said, they can age for a very long period of time. Port vintages that were largely unanimous, declared by a majority of the producers, include 2007, 2005, 2000, 1997, 1994, 1985, 1977, and 1970. You may have also come across a ruby port called a late bottled vintage port. This is a wine from a specific year, but not necessarily a declared vintage. They can be absolutely delicious and a great value. Sherry is another fortified wine. If Harvey's Bristol Cream is the only sherry you know, you're missing out on some great quality wines. Sherry takes its name from the town of Jerez in Andalusia in southern Spain. Besides Jerez de la Frontera, sherry is also made in Puerto de Santa Maria and Sanlúcar de Barrameda. The three areas together are called the Sherry Triangle, and they're quite warm as the sun shines 300 days out of the year, and the climate is practically subtropical. The main grape that makes up 90% of production of sherry is the white Palomino grape, which is known for its low acid. Pedro Ximénez, or PX for short as we say in the industry, is another white grape that, after being dried on mats in the sun, is used for sweetening. The Palomino juice is inoculated with yeast and then fermented to dryness, unlike port. The winemaker tastes the early wines in January and determines style. He'll say, these are delicate wines, and they separate those out for Fino sherries, while the richer, heavier wines are destined for the other main style, Oloroso. Now let's take a look at our sherries here. Here we have a Fino sherry, and you'll notice that it looks like white wine. Then we have an Amontillado, and even with the Oloroso, they're darker. You see that it looks very brown, very tawny. And if you have a Pedro Ximénez at home, and you found one, you'll notice that it's very dark and very viscous, almost like molasses. Now, in those barrels of Palomino wine destined for Fino sherry, a film of the yeast called flor forms at the top. And Fino sherry wines are said to have a flor or yeasty aroma. The flor yeast forms on the top of the wine and prevents oxygen from getting to the wine and turning it brown. That's why Fino sherry looks like white wine. It also reduces the acidity overall, which makes it very easy to drink. Now let's smell our Fino sherry. If you're only used to sweet cream sherries, this will probably shock you. And whenever I tell people to be prepared to taste a Fino sherry, I usually tell them it's not going to be fruity and it's not going to smell sweet. It's actually going to smell like salted almonds. So if you're a salted almond fan, you're going to love this. But you'll also notice it has a yeasty aromatic to it. That's flor that you're smelling, the yeast that forms on top. Now let's taste it. You'll notice that it's absolutely bone dry, but it's not making your mouth pucker because it's so low in acid. Now, I love to have a small glass of Fino sherry while I'm preparing dinner, and this is the perfect aperitif wine and with our hors d'oeuvres. Finos are separated out into additional styles. Finos are fortified up to 15.5% of alcohol because the flor dies anything above this. Amontillado starts life out as a Fino, but the flor dies off. It dies off on its own because the winemaker intentionally fortified the wine above 15% or exposed the wine to oxygen to kill the flor. Now let's taste our Amontillado. This one's actually bone dry as well, and you see a different range because Amontillado can be a bit sweeter, but this one happens to be quite dry. But what do you notice about the flavors in comparison to the Fino? You notice much more roasted nut character instead of just the salted raw almonds. This is definitely richer and more roasted in character. But you also get a lot of layers of flavors. You can tell that it's complex. And also notice how long the flavor lasts in your mouth. Because the flor has died, the wine is oxidized and the color and flavor becomes more complex. While I think of aperitif wine when I think of Fino sherry, Amontillado is more of a dessert wine that you savor at the end of the meal. Oloroso is an oxidized style, but without a stage with flor. They're intentionally fortifying up to 18% level of alcohol, way past the level that the flor can survive. Olorosos may also be stored outside so that the heat from the sun can naturally increase the oxidation. Now, if you have an Oloroso, taste it versus the Fino, or even against the Amontillado that you have. You're going to notice that the Oloroso is more brown and darker and fuller and sweeter than the Fino. You have some aromas of dates and dried fruit, and sometimes a little bit of molasses. And although they can be dry, most of the time they are sweet. However, if you smell it and taste it in comparison to your Amontillado, you're going to notice that the Amontillado has so many more layers of complexity and depth to it. So Olorosos can be an incredible value. A sherry is rarely sold as a vintage wine, but rather as a style, Fino style, Amontillado, or Oloroso. They blend vintages in barrels called butts made from American oak. It's a fractional system called solera. Remember this term solera, as we're going to see this in other lectures. Basically, the solera system blends old and new sherries so consistently that you can always be assured of a great bottle. Also, because these wines are very microbially stable, because of their high alcohol and tons of oxidation that's already happened, they're virtually indestructible, which is why they're kept open on the bar in most restaurants. Understand, though, that the very best way to keep these fresh tasting and in good condition for as long as possible is to refrigerate them once they've been opened. If you have an Oloroso, you will also notice that it's sweet, while the Fino and generally the Amontillado are dry. This is because PX, or Pedro Ximénez, is blended into it. Incidentally, you can find PX sherry by itself. It's extremely sweet, dark, dense, and smells of molasses. And it's a great sweetening agent for sherry, and that's why it's blended in for Oloroso. Cream sherries also use PX, but most often concentrated grape juice is added to pale cream sherries to sweeten them, which makes them taste a bit more entry-level than Oloroso. Now, the Portuguese island of Madeira is about 400 miles west of the Moroccan port of Casablanca. Madeira uses both white and red grape varieties to make their fortified wines. Tinta Negra Mole is the red grape that usually makes up the styles of the finest and reserve Madeiras, those styles. For special reserve and above, however, Madeira has its own set of noble varieties: Cercial, Verdelho, Boal, and Malmsey. And generally, that's the order of sweetness that it goes in, with Malmsey being the sweetest. Like port, fermentation is stopped once it attains the desired level of sweetness, and the wine is fortified up to 20% alcohol. However, some producers let the fermentation run its course to completion and then fortify it, just as they do in sherry. At the beginning of this lecture, I mentioned that the seafaring folk noticed that the wine got better as they traveled to the tropics. These voyages accelerated the aging of the wine, and modern producers have created two methods that replicate the impact of these long sea voyages. The highest quality wines are aged in casks in lofts, more commonly aged in a process called estufagem, for a minimum of 3 months, in a heated chamber where the wine heats to 104 to about 122 degrees Fahrenheit, or 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. Now let's see what difference this treatment makes. Smell your Madeira, or smell your Amontillado, or smell your Oloroso sherry. You'll notice a cooked aroma. In cooking, you ever hear someone say it's a Madeirized smell? Well, that's a cooked smell, but you'll also notice a very nut-like aroma in this Madeira. Now let's taste it. Wow. The acidity almost screams at you in comparison to the sherries because Palomino is so low in acid. So this is really quite high. There's something called volatile acidity, and in small amounts, it can be quite refreshing and can cut through that sweetness. However, if it's way too high, it can actually feel like a knife cutting down. If you've ever tasted vinegar by itself, just straight vinegar, you know what I'm talking about. The finest must be 3 years old, reserve 5 years old, special reserve 10 years old, and extra reserve 15 years old. A wine bearing a specific vintage must be made from one of the noble grape varieties in a single year and be aged in oak for a minimum of 20 years. This is another wine that you can easily find to present to someone on an anniversary, birthday, or special occasion. Truly great Madeira is also virtually indestructible, and bottles may be left open without the wine deteriorating. Now, around the world, there are other fortified wines, such as Australian stickies, that can be decadently sweet, although not as cloyingly sweet as PX. If you are able to find an Australian sticky, go ahead and taste it now and see if you can identify the notes before I say them. Since these wines are made with an aromatic grape variety such as Muscat, some of the aromatic notes may come through even the wine, though it's been fortified and aged to get a rich brown color and luscious notes of brown sugar, medjool dates, and caramel. Did you get any of those? If you didn't, just make note of what you did get and try smelling it along with those items. Now, you may also know that it's really quite low in acidity as well. And it's not really too high in alcohol, just like the ports, but it's round and it's luscious. However, it leaves your tongue almost cloyingly sweet. So when we say the word cloying, this is one of those wines that you can actually get that sensation. Now, one of the fortified wines, vintage port, is the only one that throws a crust. And what I mean by that is that it forms a sediment. If it's a young vintage port, decanting will circulate the air into it to tame some of those youthful, gripping tannins. And if it's an older vintage port, then decanting will help clarify the wine for you and make sure that none of those black sludge bits get into a guest's glass. The sediment consists of pigmented phenols, or tannins, that have been polymerized and become insoluble in the wine. But they're completely harmless and do not impact the quality of the wine. In fact, sediment can be a good sign of quality in older wines. Experience has shown that premium reds tend to exhibit sediment deposit more than lower quality wines. When the wine bottle is aging nicely on its side in the cellar, the sediment settles to the bottom. Because these bottles are aged on their side, the sediment falls along the side that's down. Traditionally, and you still may see some restaurants using this, is a decanting cradle or basket to transfer the wine from the cellar to the table. This keeps the bottle at about a 45-degree angle, which makes the sediment fall towards the bottom of the bottle. Its purpose is to transport the bottle from its original horizontal position in the cellar out to the table with the least amount of movement possible. However, not everyone has a decanting cradle, so you can use the more common method, which is about 12 hours in advance to serving, pull the bottle from the cellar and stand it completely upright. This allows the sediment to fall directly to the bottom of the bottle. Now, before you begin, you need to make sure that the bottle is clean. I mean, you don't want any dust or spider webs or anything getting anywhere near the decanter or the place where you're dining. So step number one, you're going to need to remove the capsule from the neck. This is going to help you see the sediment in the neck of the bottle when you decant. And obviously you need to remove the cork. But do this carefully because older wines can have a more crumbly cork, and especially if they're not taken care of properly. Step number two, you're going to light a candle. You can use a flashlight or you can use the top of an uncovered table lamp, but it's not nearly as romantic or dramatic. Step number three, you're going to hold the decanter in your left hand and you're going to hold the bottle in your right hand. Step number four, you're going to gently and steadily pour the wine into the decanter. You got to do this in such a way that you see the light go through the neck of the bottle, but you're going to do this slowly. Now, eventually, when you're getting towards the bottom, you're going to see sediment collect somewhere in the shoulder. And as you're pouring, which eventually you're going to do, is you're going to see the sediment traveling somewhere towards that neck. And when you do see some of those flecks of black sludge in the neck, you're going to stop. There we go. If there's wine left in the bottle, work on drinking on the wine you have in the decanter so far. By the time you need more wine, the sediment will have just settled enough in the wine that's left that you can decant it all over again to get those last exquisite ounces. If you're in a real rush, and you don't have several hours to wait, I've also seen people use paper coffee filters and pour the wine through the filter into the decanter. I mean, it's effective in a rush, but incredibly unromantic. So it's best to do that in emergency situations before that special date comes over for dinner. The second purpose of decanting is to circulate air through the wine, and this develops a wine's bouquet, meaning the aroma one gets from aging the wine in bottle. It also can soften the sometimes astringent tannins of very youthful tannic wines. If your purpose is aeration and not to separate the sediment, the candle really isn't very necessary, as your purpose is to get as much oxygen through the wine as you pour it into the decanter. And so that's decanting. I mean, it might seem like a lot of trouble, but these wines are worth it. So let's move on now. Now, I showed you sabering at the end of the sparkling wine lecture. And while nothing explodes in the fortified world, at least it shouldn't, there's a wonderful trick that I saw done at the Quinta do Noval estate in Portugal. They took fireplace tongs and they heated them up in the fire until they got red hot. And then they took this bottle of 1970 vintage port and placed the heated tongs around the neck and waited for about a count of 5 seconds and released the tongs. And within seconds, they tapped on either side of where the tongs had been, and off came the neck of the vintage port with a fair amount of sediment up in the neck. Next lecture, we'll dive into sweet dessert wines, ones that haven't been fortified. These are pure nectar of the gods, as some would say, and some of my favorite wines. You'll need the following wines: a Sauterne, a Beeren Auslese, or an ice wine or ice wine, as they say in English, a Tokai, any Potonios will do, a Vinsanto or Vino Passito. See you then.